Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers by Sanderson Beck. We Mexicans here in the United States, as well as all other farm laborers, are engaged in another struggle for the freedom and dignity which poverty denies us. But it must not be a violent struggle, even if violence is used against us. Cesar Chavez, September 16, 1965. History will judge societies and governments and their institutions not by how big they are or how well they serve the rich and the powerful, but by how effectively they respond to the needs of the poor and the helpless. Cesar Chavez. Cesar Estrada Chavez was born near Yuma, Arizona on March 31, 1927. His grandfather had migrated from Mexico in the 1880s, and his father, Librado Chavez, homesteaded land and ran a grocery store. During the Depression, Librado had to sell his store to pay his back taxes. A local banker had denied him a loan even though he qualified under federal guidelines. During the 1930s, about 500,000 Mexicans were repatriated or deported from the United States. In 1939, the Chavez family, along with thousands of poor whites from the Midwest and black sharecroppers from the South, went to California looking for work. His father joined various unions, and the family often quit jobs in protest of bad treatment. Cesar completed the 8th grade before he left school to work when his father was temporarily incapacitated by a car accident in 1942. The back-aching experience of using a short-handled hoe stimulated Cesar to work years later for the banning of that tool. He experienced racial discrimination, and he had been punished at school for speaking Spanish. In 1944, he was arrested for refusing to sit in the Mexican section of a theater in Delano. That year, he had joined the U.S. Navy and was sent to the Mariana Islands in Guam, where he worked as a painter. Cesar married his sweetheart Helen Fabela in 1948, and on their honeymoon they visited all the California missions. He and his parents worked as sharecroppers growing strawberries for 2 years. Then Cesar, with his growing family, spent 1.5 years working in the forests of Northern California before settling in the Saucipuedes barrio of San Jose, where Cesar got a job at a lumber mill in 1952. Ernesto Galarza had earned a Ph.D. from Columbia University and organized for the National Farm Labor Union, NFLU. He initiated the supermarket picket lines to boycott table grapes. Galarza also worked for the AFL-CIO's Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, AWOC, and advised Cesar during his early years of organizing. Under the leadership of Saul Alinsky, the Community Service Organization, CSO, had registered 15,000 new voters in 1949 and helped Edward Roybal get elected to the City Council in Los Angeles. When drunk police officers beat 7 Chicanos nearly to death in 1951, CSO efforts made authorities hold the officers accountable for what Navy men had gotten away with during the Zoot Suit riots of 1942. Cesar Chavez worked as a volunteer for the CSO, registering people to vote, and he became a friend and assistant of Catholic priest Donald McDonald, who also served farm workers. Cesar studied on his own and was especially influenced by Louis Fisher's Life of Gandhi. In 1952, Fred Ross hired Chavez to work full-time as a CSO organizer for $35 a week. During the McCarthy era, the FBI conducted various investigations of liberal groups, but Chavez persuaded the FBI not to allow the Republican Party to interfere with their voter registration efforts. From 1953 to 1955, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, deported nearly 2 million Mexicans. Chavez was an effective and hard-working organizer, and his family moved to Oakland and then to various places in the San Joaquin Valley. His salary was increased to $58 a week. In the summer of 1958, the United Packing House Workers Union promised the CSO $20,000 for a new chapter in Oxnard, and Cesar Chavez was put in charge. At this time, a big issue was the competition with the Bracero program of guest workers from Mexico that had started during World War II to provide needed labor. During a lemon workers' strike, Chavez and the CSO used persistent applications for jobs, boycotts, and sit-down strikes in the fields. They won their campaign to have local workers hired first, and their wages went up from 65 to 90 cents an hour. In 1959, Cesar wanted to start a union, but he was appointed state director of CSO and was assigned to Los Angeles, where he worked for 2 years. That year, McDonnell and another priest named Thomas McCullough, along with Dolores Huerta, persuaded the AFL-CIO to support the forming of a farm workers union, and they founded the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, AWOC. Huerta persuaded the Filipino Larry Itliong to join them. Chavez began to work with Huerta and Gil Padilla. At the 1962 annual CSO convention in Calexico, Cesar proposed a union movement for farm workers. When this was rejected, he resigned and moved to Delano in April. With little savings for his family of 8 children, Chavez often worked in the fields with his wife Helen from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., and then organized on his own the rest of the day and evening. Traveling to their camps and fields and meeting workers in their houses, he passed out more than 80,000 questionnaires on the issues. Julio Hernandez had been blackballed for being in a union in 1951, but Cesar persuaded him to try again. Dolores Huerta was upset that AWOC organizers were too cozy with contractors, and she quit to work with Chavez, who set up an office in his brother Richard's garage. In the fall of 1962, about 150 delegates of workers met at a theater and formed the National Farm Workers Association, NFWA, with a flag of a black eagle in a white circle on a red background and the motto, Viva la Causa. Chavez was elected president with Huerta, Hernandez, and Padilla as vice presidents. Dues were set at $3.50 per month, and the goal was to get the $1.50 minimum wage for farm workers with unemployment insurance. Richard Chavez was a carpenter and had built a house, and his brother Cesar got him to mortgage it so that they could start a burial insurance program and credit union. Helen Chavez set up a co-op for auto supplies and administered the credit union. Cesar was offered a $50,000 grant from a foundation, but turned it down to retain independence. He was the only union official at that time whose salary came completely from the workers. Chavez was offered a job as director of the Peace Corps in Latin America with an annual salary of $21,000. Yet he rejected that offer even though he only was getting $50 per week and sometimes still had to work in the fields. Chavez wanted to build up the organization before going on strike, and by 1964 the NFWA had 1,000 dues-paying members and more than 50 locals. In December they began their newspaper El Malcriado, which means the unruly one. In March 1965, flour workers who had been promised $9 per 1,000 plants but were paid less than $7 went on strike. During the summer, Gilbert Padilla and Protestant minister Jim Drake organized protest marches and a rent strike because of the miserable shacks in the labor camps in Tulare County. The Bracero program had been ended in 1964, but in the summer of 1965, growers persuaded Governor Pat Brown to pressure President Lyndon Johnson into reviving the program. pay had to be at least $1.40 an hour. When growers paid the domestic workers only $1.25, the Filipinos of the AWOC in the Coachella Valley went on strike and got better wages. However, other growers in the Delano area also paid less and wanted to pay Mexican Americans only $1.10 per hour. On September 8th, Larry Itliong led the Filipino workers on a strike. Chavez had been learning from the nonviolent civil rights movement led by Dr. King. He called a meeting and warned against using violence, even though violence would be used against them. And the vote for a strike was unanimous. Chavez and others found that when they did not react violently, they gained the sympathy of other workers. Cesar said, "People don't like to see a nonviolent movement subjected to violence. And there's a lot of support across the country for nonviolence. That's the key point we have going for us. We can turn the world if we can do it nonviolently." Law enforcement tended to be on the side of the growers. Confrontations occurred on the picket lines, and 44 pickets, including Helen Chavez, were arrested and transported to Bakersfield in October. Cesar Chavez publicized the violence used against them and found that such unjust acts actually helped their cause. He coordinated with AWOC leader Al Green. With Filipinos and Mexicans on strike, 48 ranches were affected. Chavez immediately sent letters to the growers to negotiate, but they were returned unopened. SNCC organizers began arriving to help, and Luis Valdez came from the San Francisco Mime Troupe and started El Teatro de Campesino to perform skits that would educate workers in the camps. In December, Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers came to support their effort, and the UAW donated money to the strike. Reuther, who led the sit-down strikes at General Motors in 1937, said, "There is no power in the world like the power of free men working together in a just cause." The NFWA was awarded a $267,887 grant from the U.S. Office of Economic Opportunity as part of its poverty program. But Chavez asked Sergeant Shriver to postpone the grant until the strike was over. During hearings of the Subcommittee on Migratory Labor, Senator Bobby Kennedy reminded Kern County Sheriff Roy Gallion, who had arrested picketers, of the U.S. Constitution. Kennedy even joined a picket line supporting the grape strike. In March 1966, Cesar Chavez organized a 250-mile march to Sacramento in 25 days that ended on Easter Sunday. But Governor Brown chose to go to Palm Springs. The Shenley Corporation was affected by the strike and offered Chavez a contract, but the powerful DeGiorgios made a deal with the Teamsters, who rushed an election on union representation. Chavez advised boycotting that election, and Dolores Huerta won the support of the Mexican American Political Association, MAPA, which convinced Governor Brown to investigate and invalidate the early election. A new election was scheduled for August 30th. The NFWA merged with the AWOC to form the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee, UFW-OC, within the AFL-CIO. Chavez became director and Itliong vice director. The UFW-OC got 530 votes to 331 for the Teamsters, and only 12 workers voted not to have a union. Martin Luther King sent them a congratulatory telegram saying, "The fight for equality must be fought on many fronts." In another election at Arvin, the UFW won by even more votes. Chavez began negotiating with DeGiorgio executives, but violence against strikers provoked Chavez into calling for a boycott against their Tree Sweet juices and S&W canned foods. When Chavez went with newly converted strikers to pick up their things at a company labor camp, they were arrested and convicted of trespassing, but this outrage won over more workers. In September 1966, the Pirelli Minetti winery made a deal with the Teamsters, and UFW declared a boycott against their labels and stores that sold their wines. In April 1967, DiGiorgio became the first employer that agreed to finance a health and welfare fund for farm workers with vacation and holiday pay. The UFW won another election against the Teamsters, and by July 1967, the biggest vintner Gallo and Christian brothers, Almaden and Paul Masson, had all agreed to negotiate with the farm workers. Padilla and Drake went to Texas, where rangers were breaking strikes. Chavez hired the lawyer Jerry Cohen, and he eventually won a suit against the Texas Rangers that was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in the 1970s. Cohen also proved that the injunctions against secondary boycotts did not apply because farm workers were excluded by the National Labor Relations Act. In August 1967, workers at the Jumara Vineyards voted to go on strike, and 2/3 of their 5,000 workers left their jobs during the harvest. Picketing was severely limited to 3 people at each entrance, and so Chavez announced a nationwide boycott of Jumara grapes. Jumara used other names, and Huerta and Ross urged Chavez to broaden the boycott to all table grapes in January 1968. Cesar Chavez was reading the writings of Gandhi and was adamant about holding to nonviolence. In October 1966, picketing Manuel Rivera was hit by a truck and disabled. An angry mob surrounded the truck, but Chavez pushed through the crowd and may have saved the driver's life. When Chavez found strikers with a few guns, he confiscated them. By February 1968, the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers had led Chicanos to form the militant Brown Berets. Chavez decided to go on a fast until the Union members renewed their commitment to nonviolence. After 13 days of fasting, he had to appear in court and was supported by 3,000 farm workers. After 25 days, Cesar broke his fast with Bobby Kennedy, who announced his candidacy for president a week later. Chavez was too weak to speak standing, and his message was read aloud by Jim Drake. In their struggle of the poor against the rich, he called upon their bodies and spirits in the cause of justice, noting that the true act of courage is sacrificing oneself for others in the nonviolent struggle. Their voter registration drive helped Kennedy win the California primary. However, that spring both Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. After Nixon's election, the Defense Department greatly increased its purchase of grapes for soldiers in Vietnam. To spread the boycott in 1969, Chavez sent Al and Elena Rojas to Pittsburgh, Jessica Govea to Toronto and Montreal, and Eliseo Medina to Chicago, where he used sit-down demonstrations in the grocery stores. Others got the distribution of grapes curtailed in Detroit, New York, Boston, and Philadelphia as well. In May 1969, Chavez and Reverend Ralph Abernathy led a march from Indio to the Mexican border. In April 1970, a committee of the National Conference of Catholic Bishops persuaded Coachella growers to negotiate. Finally, 26 grape growers went to the UFW headquarters near Delano on July 29, 1970, and signed union contracts giving farm workers $1.80 an hour and contributing 10 cents an hour to the Robert Kennedy Health and Welfare Fund and 2 cents per hour for UFW service centers. Chavez acknowledged the sacrifices of the strikers, 95% of whom had lost their homes and cars, but 85% of table grape growers in California were now under union contracts. Chavez recognized the power of individuals working together for a common good in peaceful ways that could bring about a cultural revolution. In August 1970, about 170 firms still had not switched from the Teamsters to the UFW, and Cesar Chavez called for a general strike. On August 29th, more than 20,000 people in Los Angeles marched in protest of the Vietnam War. Police used tear gas, and 3 people were killed, including Los Angeles Times reporter Ruben Salazar. Violence by the Teamsters was increasing, and the UFW's attorney Cohen was hospitalized. Dolores Huerta negotiated a 2-year contract with Inter-Harvest that raised base pay to $2.10 an hour and eliminated the use of DDT and other dangerous pesticides. Chavez spent most of December in jail for not obeying an injunction against boycotting Bud Antle lettuce. But in April 1971, the California Supreme Court ruled in his favor, deciding that the strike and boycott were legal and that the Teamsters had colluded with the growers. In the Salinas Valley, the Teamsters had made secret agreements with the growers without consulting workers, and they fired any who refused to pay dues. The UFW moved its headquarters south from Delano to La Paz. Republicans in the Arizona legislature passed laws against boycotts and limiting strikes. In April 1972, Chavez fasted for 24 days to raise public awareness, and in the fall, Arizona elected its first Mexican-American governor, Raul Castro. Because many growers were signing contracts with the bullying Teamsters, in April 1973, Chavez called for a strike. After Gallo signed a contract with Teamsters on June 27th, Chavez announced a boycott of Gallo wines. 4 days earlier, Teamsters had attacked picket lines with weapons, injuring 25 people. In August, 2 UFW members were killed, and Cesar asked union members to fast for 3 days. He canceled the strike but continued the boycott. Under President Nixon and Governor Reagan, law enforcement was hard on the strikers, and 3,500 were arrested in 1973. But most of the cases were dismissed by the courts. UFW membership fell from 40,000 to 6,500. In 1974, Nixon resigned, and Democrat Jerry Brown was elected governor. In February 1975, the UFW organized a march from San Francisco to Merced, and that year the short-handled hoe was finally banned in California. Brown and his Agriculture Secretary, Rose Bird, pushed through the Agricultural Labor Relations Act in June. Yet growers still allowed Teamsters access while barring UFW organizers, who filed more than 1,000 complaints. 80 elections enabled the UFW to increase its membership. By the end of 1975, the UFW represented 27,000 workers to the Teamsters' 12,000. But then the legislature stopped funding the Agricultural Labor Relations Board, ALRB. The Farm Workers Union tried to remedy this by putting Proposition 14 on the ballot, but the growers contributed $2 million to defeat it at the polls in 1976. The next year, the Teamsters stopped contesting the farm worker elections, and in 1978, UFW membership passed 100,000. Chavez ended the grape and lettuce boycotts. Strikers had to withstand tear gas attacks during the lettuce strike in the Imperial Valley in 1979. 2 marches to Salinas resulted in the Meyer Tomato Company agreeing to pay $5 an hour, union representatives' salaries, and for a better medical plan. The United Farm Workers experienced some dissension in the 1980s. Chavez fired some Salinas organizers. After they went on a hunger strike, he filed a $25 million lawsuit against them for libel. However, in 1982, a judge ruled that the Salinas group had been fired illegally and awarded them back pay. Some on the UFW staff objected to using the challenging interpersonal game of Synanon founder Charles Dieterich. In September 1983, a security guard shot dairy worker Rene Lopez, and the day after his death, a judge granted the union's request to disarm the Grower Seacom's guards. By 1984, UFW membership dropped below 12,000. In June of that year, Chavez announced a grape boycott to call attention to the use of dangerous pesticides. In 1988, Cesar fasted for 36 days to protest pesticides. In 1991, the UFW lost a suit to an Imperial Valley grower that would cost them $2.4 million. When they were threatened in Arizona by a $5.4 million suit by Bruce Church Incorporated, Chavez went to Arizona near his birthplace and fasted before testifying in court. After breaking his fast, he felt tired and died in his sleep on April 23, 1993. His funeral at Delano was attended by 40,000 people. By his own standard of how well an institution helps the poor, the work of Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers should receive a favorable judgment by history.